Hello, everyone. Just letting people come in. Thank you for joining us. All right, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation and welcome to the third conversation in the inaugural Conversation in Equity and Design speaker series. My name is Nathan Johnson and I'm an instructor at Minneapolis College and a partner at Formula Architecture. This project is a collaboration between Dunwoody, the Walker Art Center, MSP NOMA, AIA Minnesota, and Minneapolis College. The project grew out of a desire to address and elevate questions of ethics, equity, justice, and culture in relationship to design, practices, and education. Participating speakers in this series were selected by students from Dunwoody and Minneapolis College, whose research current designers working in the realm of equity. Engagement with these ideas will continue throughout the academic semester as students will meet directly with these practitioners and will serve as touchstones for constructive discourse. Please note the incredible lineup of speakers this fall and visit the URL on this splash page to register for additional events in this series. If you missed a past event, they are available via YouTube at the link provided. Today, we are joined by Sara Zewde, who will be in conversation with Jessica Holmes. Before I introduce them, I'd like to outline the structure of the talk today. We will start with a 30-minute presentation by Sara. This will be followed by a 15-minute conversation between Sara and Jessica. And the last 15 minutes will be voted to question and answer session with the audience. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please enter in the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom interface. Now I'm very happy to introduce Jessica Holmes. Jessica's passion for architecture comes from her desire to serve others. A Minnesota native, she found her calling in utilizing unique skills in design and communication to generate positive change for her surrounding communities. She received her education from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where she received a Bachelor of Design in Architecture, as well as a Master of Architecture and a Master of Science in Metropolitan Design. Jessica is currently a project manager at Urban Design Perspectives, a Minneapolis-based architecture firm that focuses on social and environmental equity in the built environment. Her primary role includes documentation and management of social and environmental initiatives. She is a 2015 Clarence Wigington Scholarship recipient and currently serves as Associate Director for the 2021 AIA Minnesota St. Paul Board. I now have the pleasure to introduce Sara Zewde to the conversation. Sara brings years of experience leading complex design processes across the Americas with a design approach that works explicitly to illuminate the distinct cultural and ecological qualities of a place. Sara is Assistant Professor of Practice at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and is a recipient of a number of awards, including the Herbert Award for contribution to the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT and a Seelberg Memorial Award for Urban Design. Sara was named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, a 2016 Artist in Resident at the Robert Rochberg Foundation, and in 2018 was named to the National Historic Trust Preservation Inaugural 40 Under 40 list. Most recently, she was named the 2020 United States Artist Fellow. Sara is a registered landscape architect and holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, a Master's of City Planning from MIT, and a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. Please help me in extending a warm welcome to Sara Zewde.
Thank you all for the invitation and Nathan for the introduction. I think it's all the more meaningful when the invitation comes from students. So I want to thank you all for the initiative that you all are taking. I know that it takes time and effort outside of the hard work of being a student and everything that that embodies. So thank you for the invitation. Okay, so let's just jump right into my screen. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in the Gulf Coast. I grew up in Louisiana and Texas. And it was really the aftermath of this storm event that prompted me to start to go along the journey of my intellectual formation and looking for a discipline that would allow me to understand all of the ecological, political, cultural, aesthetic, infrastructural factors that would manifest a Hurricane Katrina, and also a discipline that would allow me to intervene in that. And so the journey of all of the different degrees and experiences in my bio are really a function of looking to triangulate between different ways of understanding and different ways of intervening. And so today I'm a practitioner, I'm a researcher. I'm also have this firm, Studio Zewde, a landscape architecture firm based in New York City. And we are, so whenever the world opens back up fully again, you guys are welcome to come to New York City and visit our studio on Lenox Avenue. So we are 8 people, and we are interdisciplinary. We have everything from landscape architecture to soil science to theater design to studio art, and all of our work is really about all these different ways of thinking and manifesting them towards the built environment. And the way that we talk about our design methodology is that it's powered by site interpretation and cultural narrative, and that we bring our understanding of the physical realm and the cultural realms all the way through a dedication to the craft of construction. What that means is we, for instance, we don't have a details library. We are really looking at research and narrative and interpretation as a means of crafting new ways of making things, new, the way a material gets expressed, or the way two materials come together, or a sort of material and planting hierarchy. It's also within those small decisions that make a place feel like it belongs in its context and make people feel like they belong in the place. I think the office's methodology is really a function of not taking that for granted. That it's not just saying that you want to do the right thing, and it's not even just about process. Although you'll see in our work that we have a emphasis on process, but it's really what gets built in the landscape that can really, as I said, make someone feel like they belong in the world. I'll just add that Bell Hooks, who's a very influential writer for me, writes about the aesthetics of being, and in view of the conversations on equity, sort of overarching theme, I often reflect on the aesthetics of being, in that to be a woman, to be Black, to be an immigrant, to be poor, to be a Southerner, to be what have you, a refugee, all of the different B's that one might have. There's an aesthetic to being, and so our design methodology then as an office is really about identifying what those aesthetics are and designing to amplify and anchor them. And so we take this methodology and are able to work across scales and across geographies, really at a range of different project types. I'll just share a few of them with you today to give you a sense of how this kind of hits the ground. This is a small project from like 2013 or so. I selected these projects a little bit in view of the fact that there are conversations in Minneapolis happening now about memory and memorials that are probably going to influence really the future of public space and memory around the world. So this is a streetscape project in Houston, Texas, in a neighborhood called Friedmans Town. Friedmans Town was constructed by people freed after emancipation, and they left the cotton plantations along the Brazos River and settled a portion of Buffalo Bayou. So we're talking about this section here, where despite its proximity downtown, a lot of the conditions of the clay being clay soil, making it very prone to flooding, really thick, swampy, sort of vegetation, made it undesirable to settle, which is why it was unsettled despite its location and where these settlers chose to construct this community. This is, they built their own schools and institutions. They made their own bricks to pave their own streets. These are all things that the city of Houston would not do for them at the time. The neighborhood quickly became the heart of civic Black Houston, home to shop owners, teachers, lawyers, and doctors. And the neighborhood's fallen victim to what many neighborhoods have in the urban core, a freeway bisecting the neighborhood, urban renewal, and most recently, really intense development pressures given its proximity to downtown. So I was working for a landscape architecture firm at the time that was commissioned by, or that was subcontracted to by a civil engineer, was commissioned by the city of Houston to upgrade the sewer system on this street. So on the left, you can kind of see the historic grain or grid of the neighborhood and the kind of scale of disruption and urban renewal you see throughout the neighborhood. So, the project was to upgrade the sewer system and by virtue of that, reconstruct the streetscape. And they hired the landscape architects to do what people think landscape architects do, which is to tell them where to put the trees and where to put the curbs and pick benches out of a magazine. And they were like, oh, well, because of the history, maybe you can put a plaque or a statue, or maybe you can put African symbols in the paving. But I really wanted to push how we tell stories in the landscape, and went on this journey of researching the architecture that the freedmen and women constructed, and found that its antecedent is in the Yoruba of West Africa. And when they were trafficked to the Americas, they brought that architectural typology to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And then during the bloody Haitian Revolution, many people went to New Orleans, which was also French-speaking at the time. And from there, it spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas. And what makes this type unique, among many things, is the short end of the home facing the front really meant that each block was really intensely social. In other words, you could really maximize the number of people having a face each block. And the ubiquity of the porch and the alignment of the streets, or of the stairs, and the lack of really a setback meant that there was a sort of gallery of spaces created that really sits in between the public and private realms. When you talk to people about their memories of this neighborhood, it's really within that gallery of spaces that that's the space that hosts the sort of complex memories and associations that people have of the neighborhood. So while some of these structures still exist, I went out and documented the patterns created by the stairs, porches, windows, and doors. Even looking at the original pavers that the settlers laid. So if you look in the straightaway of the roadway, there's an orthogonal pattern to the pavers. And then in the intersections, that breaks and forms a diagonal. And the elders in the neighborhood say that that was done to mark the space of the intersection as these spaces of ritual. So the streetscape design that I proposed was essentially concentrated all of the salvageable historic bricks in the intersections. And here, where there was an adjacent school and they asked that there be a site wall between the street and the school, I instead proposed a series of these concrete panels that abstracts the essential dimensions of this historic architecture to tell the story of how this neighborhood was constructed. And the modesty of the material and the color, really speaking to the modesty of the original structures themselves. This is me modeling the patterns created by the shadows in the cutout windows and doors. I proposed that the concrete be cast with the wood panels from the structures as they continue to come down, so that the panels are actually grains, physical grains of the original structures. And so, instead of site furnishings off the shelf, the porches of these panels really become a public offering of seating. And in that way, it's not about reading about the architecture on a plaque, but it's provoking and prompting those kinds of intimate relations that the neighborhood has borne witness to over time. The plant palette itself also speaks to the the vegetation along the bayou that the original settlers worked with, and also creating a microclimate for the Houston heat. The school, adjacent school district, saw what we were doing and proposed that we also include this portion of their property. So we incorporated this area called the sanctuary. And essentially it's a series of brush arbors that both collects some of the storm water with a series of bioswales, which is a tradition that actually the original settlers incorporated into the urban fabric, but also as creates moments for people who've already been displaced to come and actually spend time here and have a place to hang out in the neighborhood. And so, one thing from this project that's really become a theme in my work and our office's work is, these are the materials of everyday life, of everyday landscape architecture. This is a streetscape project. We're talking about paving, walls, site furnishings, lighting, plant palette. This is, so this, you don't have to wait for a memorial commission. That everything that we do in the built environment is a chance to tell a story. And we can question every convention that there is. Why is the bench the way it is? Why is the lighting the way it is? And use it to shed light, literally and metaphorically, on other stories. This is a 2018 commission that we had for the Fairmount Park Conservancy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to do a landscape plan for a 22-acre site of Fairmount Park. This is in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood, a historically African-American neighborhood, about 2 miles north of downtown. The neighborhood sees a lot of vacancy, a lot of unemployment. The high school is considered the most violent high school in America. And for many people, this park is a chance to get away. And that was the thing we heard the most when we started on this project was, my first kisses here. My football coach that changed my life and taught me what discipline is here. The significance of this park in people's lives was incredibly notable, and we really saw the charge to bring the physical existing conditions, so these are the existing conditions, up to the level of bring it into union essentially with the significance that it plays in people's lives. Sports among them were very central to the sort of intergenerational programming and symbolism of the park, and which has ripple effects throughout the community. One of the first things that we did and often do is really deep research into the site, and we found these archival images of the park and learned, that basically people's connections to this park are generational, and people, kicking off the project by sharing our archival images really opened people up to the process and, made them want to open up to us about what this place meant to them. One community member gave us this poem, and it says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And the idea of a monument that breathes really became a conceptual and creative departure for us. Our first community engagement event, we didn't draw anything. We just wanted to celebrate the park just the way it was. And so we hired caterers from the neighborhood. We had t-shirt making. We had rappers and musicians come and perform about what they love about Mander. Mander, it being the rec center and what this part of the park is known as. It also became a site analysis tool for us to actually see the way the park was being used in a really concentrated way. And so people thought they were just attending a party. It wasn't a meeting where you have like rows of seats in a slideshow. So for instance, we had these prompts around the party where people could fill out and really celebrate what this community is just today. And then at a certain point, we switched out the barbecue for aerial maps, and we had the 150 participants, or partygoers, I should say, get into 6 groups and make collective collages about what they love about this park. And so in this way, really people were in dialogue with each other and wasn't really the designers versus the community members, kind of breaking down that binary. And really, we spread ourselves across the 6 groups and joined there. But really they were in dialogue and tension with each other, trying to identify what are the priorities of this place. And then, representatives from the 6 groups presented to the larger group, and it gave us a chance to hear how people speak and articulate and prioritize what's important about this park. We took those 6 collages and, instead of doing a sort of 1-for-1, like, oh, somebody put a picture of bike parking here, therefore we're going to put bike parking there. It was really, we did this sort of interpretive analysis about what are the emerging themes, what are the orientations, how do people understand how to move through the park? And we were able to identify 3 sort of spatial themes that came through in all of the collages. One was activating 33rd Street, this residential edge all the way to the north side. Second was bringing people into the heart of the campus. And third was creating a clear and legible circulation system around the park. And so we were really able to, throughout the process, go back and forth and say, here's your input, here's how we interpreted it, and here's how it very directly translates into the landscape plan. So we have a large welcoming garden walk from the north, where people feel on the north side that they're less served by the park, that it's not really meant for them. We doubled down, working with Dixa Architects, doubled the square footage of the rec center. Because of the centrality of sports in the neighborhood, we really created this topographic bowl that frames and holds the sports. And around the edge of the sports and a flexible lawn is this grove of trees and sort of a picnic grove, a family reunion grove. We heard a lot about family reunions happening here. We also developed a memory plan. So as we heard people's stories and memories of the neighborhood, each of these, we wanted to basically be accountable for those memories, particularly in face of the threat of displacement, that what we were designing in these investments in the park were really about anchoring those traditions, fortifying them actually into the future. And I think that translation was really helpful in communication. John Coltrane grew up on 33rd Street facing the park, and on the left you see this sketch of the mathematics of jazz music that he did. And so we translated that sketch into a paving pattern across that stretches across the park and became a sort of armature for wayfinding and inscriptions about notable people from the neighborhood. So this is the family reunion picnic grove. Meat Mill, who's a rapper, is from the neighborhood, so you'll notice he's hanging out in this rendering, which people got a kick out of. And then in the plaza, looking out into this bowl of a lawn, there's a water feature with the words of the poem about the breathing monument inscribed below, so that as you're looking out, you're really reflecting on the idea that this community itself is the breathing monument. This is another small scale project. This one's in Houston, and I just noticed it's two Houston and 2 Philly projects. But Barbara Jordan Rising, this was a competition, and I thought about this one because the commission was to memorialize Barbara Jordan, and memorializing a person is difficult, is challenging, and so we had a particular approach to doing that I wanted to share. And that was about talking about the community and the history from which a Barbara Jordan emerges. Similar to the Genesee Street Friedmans Town community, the San Felipe Trail led a lot of people to the 3rd Ward and the 5th Ward, where Barbara Jordan grew up and went to school in Houston, along the same water body. In our archival work here, we found that as these communities traveled into Houston, that there was this rich tradition of gathering by the water that was really important to the establishment of institutions and schools that propelled Barbara Jordan to be a congresswoman. And so we really kind of analyzed that tradition and wanted to speak to that as central to the idea that there may be future Barbara Jordans. And so this is us just kind of piecing together the story of from traveling along the Buffalo Bayou to the institutions along the Bayou's banks to the birth of a Barbara Jordan. And the memorial that we were asked to design was at the Gregory School, which was the first public school for Black students in Texas. So this is our looking at the 1907 drawings of the site and finding that the original, quote, Negro Institute was actually in what's an open lawn now and not a part of what is on the site today. And so we wanted to kind of echo the historic footprint and design the memorial with relationship to that history that's layered into the ground. And we kind of, culling from Barbara Jordan's legacy and her own words, we identified a few key materials that we could use to translate that legacy. She talks about the soil as being emblematic of the spirit of Texas, and giving her the feeling that she can accomplish whatever she wants. That red clay soil from that was at Genesee Street. And she talks about education as a sort of foundation. And so we really saw that the foundation emerging from the banks, from the soil. And then the banks and the bayou itself are really the kind of armature for all of this. And so that's really became the material palette for this quarter-acre site. This red clay, I mean, it's concrete, but red colored concrete to represent the red clay soils, literally designed to emerge and float above this water feature that's meant to represent the bayou itself, and the sort of vegetation also creating a cool environment. But in this way, this memorial is not a thing that you look at. It's not an object on a pedestal. It's not a wall with names on it, but it's really becomes a space that is an activation in and of itself. And so, we thought about all the different ways that they could activate and continue to propel future organizations, future institutions, future communities, future Barbara Jordans. So in its use as a plaza, in its use as an outdoor classroom in this building currently as a public library, in the idea that it could also perform or function as a stage for the larger lawn, that the water feature itself was an everyday play element for kids in the neighborhood, and all of those activities overlapping onto one another. That sort of catalytic little activation could from which future Barbara Jordans can rise. I'll share this one last project. This is called Graffiti Pier, and this is for the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation. We were commissioned to develop a landscape design for Pier 18 and Pier 20, as well as some of the upland areas. And our early research showed that when coal declined in the 1970s in the state of Pennsylvania, it happened to coincide with the invention of graffiti, which was invented in Philadelphia, not in New York, as they love to remind us. And so our site was an old coal chute, and when it fell into disuse, it emerged as a really important place for the development of street art and graffiti specifically. And that continued until something happened in 2010, which was the start of Instagram, and the site became the most Instagram spot in Philadelphia. And became a huge liability with hundreds of people coming, for the railroad company that owned it. So they were in conversation with our client, who commissioned us to develop a plan for this landscape. As you can imagine, the graffiti writers were not happy about the idea of landscape architecture happening here. In their minds, that means the High Line, and they, were very much opposed to the idea. And as you can tell from this image, it's already a very beautiful space. It's a very dynamic street art museum. So it was a tricky kind of entry point into a project, but we knew some early pressures and challenges that the site was going to face, and we proposed a community engagement strategy here that was less public than normally we do, because graffiti writers thrive on anonymity. You know, they have day jobs and government names and monikers, and we had to respect that. And, you know, they've been criminalized, in fact, for their use of the site and the beauty that they've imbued in it. We wanted to be respectful of that. So we proposed a series of off-the-record conversations, one-on-ones, small groups. We had representatives sent to us. We had anonymous emails and folk calls. We met at bars. This is one of the bars we had a meeting at. We had a bar tab from our client, and really tried to, you know, tap into the ways in which people in this culture are already dialoguing. And one of the earliest things we shared was, you know, if we do nothing, which is what they wanted, in 25 years, the site would be inundated by rising tides, and on a daily basis, just by high tides. And not only was there pressure coming from the water side, but from the land side, where urban development was encroaching on the site. And so this project of landscape architecture is really the only chance that they had to save Graffiti Pier. So we started to rebrand it as the Save Graffiti Pier project. Across the many conversations we had, we asked everyone, what is the best thing that could happen as a function of this project, and what is the worst thing that could happen? And we charted on this map all the different responses and started to identify the emerging themes. And we said, you know, this is what emerges and has emerged in all of our conversations: ensuring the continuation of art, keeping the site vegetated and passive, making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. And, you know, we said that, you know, again, we came back to them intermittently throughout the process and shared with them the input, our interpretation of it, and how we were incorporating these guidelines in our work. And so, you know, we're able to come back and say, you know, here's how the design is really ensuring the continuation of art and keeping the site vegetated, passive, and making it safe and accessible, looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. When we asked the graffiti writers, what does gritty mean? You know, they said rocks and plants and mud and water. And it was interesting to hear that, because, you know, that meant that the ecosystem of graffiti intersected with the ecosystem of this historic intertidal marsh. And so we proposed the removal of the bulkheads here and the integration of an intertidal landscape, which would allow the site to encroach upland as the tides continue to rise. And so to kind of embed the climate change adaptability into the site design. It would also provide a visual buffer from the encroaching urban development that's happening on either side. And so the client was supportive of this idea because of both the ecological and cultural dimensions of what it would offer. And so here's our landscape design at the end of the concept phase. You know, throughout the process, we actually took some of the early renderings to the graffiti writers, and they actually tagged on the renderings their feedback. And we went through the process of decoding those tags and integrating their feedback back into the design development of the landscape. So for instance, this is a green frame that we designed that really was meant to keep the site feeling like it was nestled away in the middle of nowhere, even though there's all this development happening around it. We designed these custom site furnishings to introduce more surfaces for art. We found the 1923 archival drawings of the railings. We thought these are so beautiful, and while they're not up to today's code, we were able to integrate them. So you'll see those in the renderings. And then when COVID hit, we, you know, needing to keep in contact with the graffiti writers, we made a zine with them remotely. And they would go out to the site and write and take pictures and send it to us. And we integrated their works into the landscape drawings. And we physically had drop-off spots where they could come pick a few up and distribute them among their networks. And there was postcards inside so they could return any feedback last round of input to us. So I'll just end with a few before and after. This is before and this is after. So you see us, you know, designing with the idea of the 1923 railings, and the green frame and the intertidal marsh, wetlands, and some new seawalls for more art. This is before and this is after. So this is upgraded surfacing, making it ADA accessible, and introducing bioswale here for urban stormwater management. This is before and this is after. So what we've done is upgraded surfacing and also introducing a more robust and resilient plant palette. You know, a lot of these are volunteer species, and what we wanted to do was trace where the volunteer species were emerging, and keep some of the character, but introduce a more appropriate plant palette. This is before and this is after. So really interpreting this sort of shady pocket underneath the structure into a shade garden with some of the site furnishings. This is before and this is after. So you see some of our site furnishings, this more robust planting palette and some shade trees. And this is before and this is after. You know, this is on top of the trestle, and you know, this is the part where they're like, whatever you do up there, don't make it the high line. So you see here a pretty simple plant palette of grasses and sedums and gravel paths, and we have introduced an ADA ramp here to make this ADA accessible at the top, and you get the great views of downtown Philadelphia. And then Pier 20, the pier that's falling into the water, we've proposed to shore this up structurally, introduce a taller seawall, so it's actually something that can be used for making art, but really being craftful about how the marsh planting happens here. And so as the tides rise, the graffiti writers can actually be in dialogue with the rising tides using these new seawalls, and you know, making Pier 20 a place for gathering. So I will end it there. I hope that the selection of projects gives you a sense of a little bit of how I started, which was to say that a lot of our process is about a really sincere and robust approach to understanding cultural and site narratives and designing something that's really unique and resonant to the place such that it makes the people there feel like they belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a really great array of projects that you had to share with us, and really thought-provoking. Again, I want to introduce myself to everyone. I'm Jessica Holmes, and I have also a background in architecture and community public interest design, and as well as urban design. And the work that you presented, Sarah, is really inspiring and really gets us thinking and excited about the future of what landscape architecture and design in general can be. You know, really, I appreciate the way that you have formed your practice to incorporate all of these different elements of research. I wrote research narrative, dedication to craft, and really, you know, understanding the narrative of place. I appreciate how you dive in so deeply into that, you know, and, you know, understanding that both people and materials can benefit from this, and understanding of context, and this feeling of belonging. You mentioned, something that stood out to me was you mentioned that in that poem, you know, a monument that breathes, and, you know, celebrating this park as it is a living, you know, entity where people come and explore and interact with that space organically. And I'm wondering, in that process of developing, you know, a monument that breathes, if you will, how would you say that, you know, the community voice and, you know, incorporating equity into that, how would you say the community voice really helps define how you approach that project?
Yeah, you know, if you'll notice in all of the work, you never heard me say that we ask people what they want, because, you know, we can't give everyone what they want. It's just not possible. And so, and that's not really, as I see it, the role of a public-facing architect. I think it's the role of interpretation. And so that's why the questions that we ask people are more in the realm of, you know, what's the best thing that can happen here? What do you love about this place? And that starts to give us usable data that, you know, with constant kind of checking in, we can interpret and relay into something that, you know, none of us individually would have imagined. So it's not about everybody coming to a public meeting and everybody coming with their own design, but it's about more the role of the architect as an interpreter, as a way to develop a collective vision. And everybody coming to the table with their own vision is not the best first step in doing that. And so, you know, I think that community engagement rhetoric and methodology should be evolved. I think we've been kind of stuck in the last 70 years, you know, post-urban renewal, in the way that we talk about public participation in the literature and how we teach it. And I think it's starting to change now, but I think we have a lot of work to do in you know, having really effective models for doing that.
That's great. Yeah. And, you know, getting into that a little deeper, you know, as in your role as sort of the facilitator or the interpreter, you know, you kind of take on this role of a translator as well. And so I'm wondering, you know, how do you maintain the integrity of the vision that the public might have throughout the entire process? And how do you keep it from getting lost in translation, you know, as you go through policy and funding and you know, all the hurdles that we have to jump?
Well, the people will tell you, and that's why, like, you know, I like to structure our engagement to be pretty repetitive. Like, it's not, we just see them at the, you know, we just have community engagement in the beginning and the end, but really it's an ongoing dialogue. And it, you know, telling a presentation or giving a presentation like this and showing projects like this doesn't do the process service, in a sense. You know, it's a messy process. I mean, a lot of times we're not right the first time. We're never right the first time. And there's maybe no such thing as right, but there's definitely something about resonance that we're striving for. And that's where the intermediate and intermittent check-ins with the public is really helpful, because they can tell you when you're getting off course, and they will.
Great. I want to ask one more question and then I'll get to the Q&A. So again, if anybody has any questions that they'd like answered, just enter those in the Q&A section. I know there are a lot of students watching today. And so I kind of want to dive into a little bit about your background and how your education has shaped the way that you practice landscape architecture and the way that you think about it. Was there any specific coursework that really inspired you to go down this route of, you know, really public engagement?
I have to say, I mean, again, I think things are changing since I was in school. They definitely are. I wasn't really introduced to much of it. Most of what I read about public participation was from the 70s. And so I was mostly inspired by what I saw just as a layperson, you know, going to community meetings in Louisiana after Katrina as a layperson and seeing the shortcomings of the profession from that perspective. That was really why I ended up joining the profession. I, you know, was like, oh, what's going on? Why is this so hard to do? Let me go see what they learn. And then I went to go learn what they learn, and I realized why architects struggle so much at this. And so I think that there's better and more work being done now than, you know, than there was when I was in school.
Great, thank you for that. I'm gonna transfer over into some of the questions from the audience. So a question from Samuel: do you think architecture can ever be the counterculture, or is the best we can do just working alongside the counterculture?
Interesting. Well, when I think about Graffiti Pier, there's no semblance of us being counterculture. Like, there's just not even, we're working for public entities, and but I do think working alongside counterculture, alongside activists, alongside artists, alongside communities is really a careful process. It's a craft, and yeah, it's delicate, and we take that very seriously. But I would never claim that we ourselves as a profession necessarily are, in part because of the role of advocacy that we often have to play in large scale projects. It means that we are engaging, with institutions in a way that I would probably not classify as counterculture.
So Mary Margaret asks, were there any ideas or designs that were introduced that felt too inauthentic and that were rejected in the process? I'm sure it's difficult finding the balance between organic and, the constraint.
Absolutely, all the time. But that's why the nature of the question, the nature of the format of the engagement itself is really important, so that it doesn't feel like, and that it isn't, that people are giving you input that's not to be used, but rather they're giving you input that can be interpreted, and it doesn't come off as, oh, I had this idea and I didn't take it, but rather, here's how I answered the question. Here was my collage. Here's how it got translated. At the end of the Mander planning process, we had this final kind of presentation, and there was a guy that had never been to any of the meetings before, and he was kind of causing some trouble, and he was like, why are there only 5 bathrooms? And I was, getting nervous, and this woman in the second row stood up and she was like, Daryl, you haven't been to any of these meetings. Like, this is our work that we've been putting together. If you have a problem with this, you're gonna have to talk to me. And that was like a really important moment for me to understand really what could be possible, the level of ownership of the process that can be had when you're creating a process that doesn't have people feel like they are just giving ideas into the ether and they're not being used, but rather they're giving input that's meant to be interpreted, and that they understand that interpretation and how it leads into the place of design.
Yeah, that's great. I think it definitely, you're right. It can be difficult, making sure that voices are heard. And quick question, I'm wondering, in the wake of pandemic life that we're in now, how do you feel that things have shifted, or the way that you engage with public? How has that improved or, shifted for better or worse for your process? Because I ask because it can be difficult gaining trust and, maintaining that relationship with community. And so I'm wondering how you found that process.
Yeah, definitely the beginning, very, very difficult. But I think what we learned was ultimately we can approach it in a similar way that we did before, in the sense that our approach is, we never do the same kind of engagement format or method the same way twice. It's actually a design process in and of itself to figure out how you're going to do the engagement. So what we do is really understand the ways in which communities are already in dialogue with each other and try to tap into that. So at Mander, we knew that people were having block parties, so we had a block party. Graffiti Pier, we knew that artists were making zines, so we made a zine, and that was post-COVID. And all of the dialoguing has morphed into different things now, whether that's IG Live or whether that's following certain influencers or what have you. But it's the same method ultimately, which is how are people talking to one another already, instead of asking them to step outside of their everyday lives, really figure out a way to step into the rituals of the place, and people, yeah, that's still happening even in the pandemic.
Another question from Sue. Have you worked in public spaces that are occupied at times by people who are housing insecure? And have you been able to include them in your public space planning?
Great question. One of our earliest projects was it was a public art installation called the Living Room Project. And this is in Seattle, in an alley that was sort of infamous, and had a lot of services for housing insecure folks, and but had become kind of exemplary in a sense. Exemplary is not even the right word, but it's kind of a cautionary tale, probably is better said, about the kind of social divisions that happen between the housing insecure and the larger population. So what we did was we worked with the nonprofits in the alley to develop a installation, a day-long, large-scale living room in the middle of the alley. And, you know, we really designed it like we would design a landscape. And just the sense of care and attention to detail in the installation in this large, I mean, when I say large living room, I mean there was large couches, there was a living room furniture at a large scale, and the kinds of conversations and relationships that were made in that space just for the temporary installation changed my life, and I think have set me on a course in terms of an approach to designing public space, in the sense that there is a way to design spaces where these populations are integrated and actually servicing and serving the ways in which we need them to. So it's funny, a lot of the projects that we worked on to date haven't had significant populations of housing insecure folks on the site themselves. So as an office, we haven't tackled that in a design for construction project, but the experience of the living room project, I think, has set the foundation for how we want to approach that.
Great, thank you. Gonna do one more question. Have you run into any problems where the community has pushed back against or rejected proposed measures of sustainability? And if so, how have you responded?
No, I cannot say that I've had that situation.
That's great. And I also wanted to note, you know, I really appreciate in your work that you sort of seamlessly incorporate sustainability and climate awareness in your work as a result of, you know, the initial research and understanding site ecology as well as culture and history, given that context.
Yeah, I think there's a way, I mean, thank you for acknowledging that, because that is something that is important to us, and that, you know, I think that we assume sustainability has a sort of aesthetic, or ecological design has a certain aesthetic. And I challenge us in our office to really, like, you know, why are we doing swoopy swoops on this biosphere? Like, is there a reason we're doing that? Or we think that's what biosphere is supposed to look like, you know? We're designing landscapes, and landscapes are cultural spaces, and they have ecological performance embedded in them. And so it's funny because often people say, well, I know like ecological design and sustainability is not your thing, and I'm like, that's embedded in all of this work. I mean, because we're talking about the resilience of people and places, and, you know, and so I thank you for acknowledging that, and it's definitely there in all of the work. But what's there is an assertion about how we do it. I often talk about cultural ecologies, that our understanding of ecology is not just a science-based one; it's also a social one, and that can lead to new innovations. And a lot of cultures and traditions have long histories of ways of living in spaces, of ways of adapting in landscapes, and we can be drawing from all of that to design more resilient futures.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your insightful input and answering these questions for us. You left us all very inspired and excited for approaching projects in the future. I want to close out with an exercise that Sara proposed that we try out. It's called the Kaleidoscope Exercise. And I'll turn it over to Sara to give a brief introduction for how we can do this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, for moderating and all your great questions and all the questions from the audience. I wanted to see if you all would entertain this idea of a kaleidoscope. It's something that I used to do at lectures that were in person, and I'm guessing based on how much you guys are using the chat that you'll also be great at this in Zoom land. But basically the idea is, you know, a lecture is kind of a weird idea. It's like one person up there speaking about their, you know, experiences and thoughts, and everybody asking the questions, and the whole thing is made to seem like the person who's giving the lecture has all the answers when they don't. They have questions too. And so the kaleidoscope is really, we could just take the last 5 to 10 minutes where everybody just asks questions. You can put them in the chat, and I won't answer them. Nobody will answer them. I'll also ask questions. Everybody can just ask questions, and we can all just, what ends up usually happening is the questions start to build on each other, but just so that we leave the event all with questions. And you know, the event isn't just tied up in a bow, but really it's just propelling us to continue to ask questions. So whatever questions that this conversation is inspiring in your mind, what, you know, as you sit there in your bedroom or whatever listening to this lecture, what questions do you have, not just for me, but of the world, of our profession? And let's just leave on some questions.
That's great. So everybody just add your questions into the chat. And I find that, you know, when we ask questions, we can learn as well. You know, a question someone else might have might be one that I didn't even think about. And so it gets that cycle going. So let's see if we could take until maybe, in the interest of time, I'd say till 1:02. Few minutes and can close out. So I'll start reading some of these off. How can we get more youth involved? What makes someone from outside the community feel like they belong to a space once they move into the community? What would you do differently on Graffiti Pier? How do you make those initial connections with the community? How do you think deep public process, sorry, these are moving kind of fast. How do you think deep public process are best taught in design school? How do we learn about the history of spaces? What is a good resource for starting community engagement on a project? How do we demonstrate it's a larger community need, not just those who use or are at the site? How do people of color get more engaged in urban planning? How do we make nonprofit housing that is safe and offers personal space for the homeless population? How do we foster, nurture, sustain a genuine ethos for ethos of care, tenderness, and repair in our landscapes, human and non-human relations? How do you know you've done it right? How do we build stewardship for long-term sustainability? How do you find open-minded clients like these? How do architects write community workshops into the design process so clients know it's a phase just like any other and dollars are assumed to it? How do we change the narrative around sustainability from being an add-on to being an integral to the design project? How do we encourage this inclusivity thinking and this inclusive thinking into our society? And then I'll end with one more. Do community spaces get to evolve if they are based in historic research? All right, so thank you everybody so much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I hope we all learn something that we can take away and apply to our lives and our practice. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Nathan to close out. Nathan, you're on mute.
Yep. Thank you, Sarah and Jessica, for this compelling conversation in equity and design. There's a very powerful speech, very powerful Q&A. It's amazing. You certainly have given us a lot to think about. Thank you for all of the audience members for your insightful questions. And thank you to our partners, the Walker Art Center, AIA Minnesota, MSP NOMA, and Dunwoody College for making this series possible. Please check out the other series that are available through YouTube, but also the next series on 11/3 or November 3rd that AIA Minnesota will be hosting. There's a talk at 12:30 between Majora Carter and Aaron Regal Breton. You can register at the URL listed on this page. Thank you everyone for your participation.